Glad to have people back who were here yesterday. My name is Graham Wilson. I'm the director of the Initiative on Cities, and it's my opportunity to welcome some of the people to the conference who weren't able to make it yesterday. Yesterday we piled on quite a few problems, and we probably maybe got you feeling a little bit down, but today we'll have lots of solutions, and we'll all leave with all the challenges of fiscal leadership in the modern city neatly tucked away. So in order to help us to do that, it's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Lusk, who is the wonderful executive director of the Initiative on Cities and is the person who has done so much to get the initiative and this conference going as well as it has. Catherine.
Thank you, Graham. As I'll reinforce what Graham said, it really is a pleasure to welcome you all here this morning for Day 2 of Fiscal Leadership in the Modern City. I am Catherine Lusk, Executive Director of the Initiative on Cities and one of your hosts for these 2 days, so thank you for being here with us. You know, when we initially conceived of this event, we wanted to spend the first day talking about where the money's going. So we heard yesterday about looming pension obligations. We talked about perhaps inevitable rising healthcare costs. We heard about the trillions of dollars, unfortunately, needed to invest in aging urban infrastructure in this country. And we also heard from the wisdom of current and former elected officials who reminded us about the importance of direct city services and the opportunity to invest in cities to improve the prosperity of those who choose to live and work in them. But we wanted to spend Day 2, as Graham said, focusing on some more positive notes and talking about, more importantly even, where the money is going to come from. So how are we actually going to continue to invest in cities? What are the new sustainable revenue sources that are attractive to voters and, frankly, politically viable? So we'll hear this morning from some panelists who are going to talk about new sources of revenue, discussing pilot payments and other innovations at the city level. We'll also talk about when and under what circumstances constituents are willing to pay for what their cities need. When are those tax increases politically viable? In the afternoon, we're going to talk about the most critical tool in the toolkit for mayors and city leaders of municipal bonds. And we're also going to highlight a theme that came up again and again yesterday, which is efficiency in municipal operations. And we are going to talk about one of the themes that emerged as well around the regionalization and potential regionalization of city services. And then we'll close today hearing from 2 leading mayors here in Massachusetts who have proven to be remarkable fiscal stewards, incredibly young, innovative, and remarkably talented at transforming the fiscal health of their cities. You know, for those of us who've had an opportunity to work in city government, we know how hard it can be. We know that there are a lot of rules that are both safety precautions and handcuffs. We know that often there are a lot of entrenched interests competing for scarce resources. We know that caution is often competing with innovation. But we know that at the end of the day, the decisions that are made at the city and local level do impact the quality of people's lives. So, you know, in spite of the challenges, as Mayor Taveras reminded us yesterday, you know, sometimes you have to let people be angry. Sometimes you have to let people, you have to acknowledge that this is about people's lives and that a lot of folks have fulfilled their end of the bargain. And you need to let them sit in a room and get mad at you. You need to let the voters respond. You need to have the community meeting. And you need to remember at the end of the day that this is about municipal workers. This is about business owners. This is about homeowners. Mayor Menino, our co-founder, often liked to say that he was mayor of all the people, that he was mayor of the people who could vote, and he was mayor of the people who didn't have the right to vote or weren't yet able to vote. And he reminded us every day that when you work in government, that is centrally what your job is all about, is protecting those people, making their lives better. So I want to just start our day by saying thank you. Thank you for all of you in the room. Thank you to everyone who was with us yesterday as well. Thank you for your commitment, evident, if by nothing else, your presence here, your commitment to improving the quality of people's lives. And now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Stacy Fox to the stage. Excuse me. Stacy Fox is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for DuPont and served as the former Deputy Emergency Manager for the City of Detroit, where she helped lead the city through the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. We are so thrilled to have Stacy with us because it's clear that the issues Detroit faced are, in fact, cut across all the panels and all the topics and everything we're actually covering over these 2 days, right? They were dealing with pension obligations. They were dealing with performance and service delivery, revenue sustainability, infrastructure, OPEB, all of the discussions and topics, every single panel that we've discussed. So Stacy's job with others was to restructure the balance sheet for the city of Detroit and to run its operations, to take on all of the issues we're talking about all at once in a very short window of time. Please join me in welcoming Stacy Fox.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here as the kickoff speaker for the positive day, as opposed to yesterday. That would have been a bummer. But and it really is a positive story that I'm here to tell you about better living through bankruptcy, I guess. But on July 18th, just to set the stage, 2013, wait, I've got to get the clicker going here. There we go. On July 18th, 2013, the City of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection, marking the start of the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. I had the privilege of serving as Deputy Emergency Manager alongside Kevin Orr through this historic and really interesting journey, and thought that I would share some of our experiences with you today. And I thought I'd frame my remarks around sort of what we went into, what we were facing as we filed bankruptcy, some of the key milestones of the Chapter 9 case, and then how the city's positioned today. To begin, the downward spiral of Detroit obviously began decades ago. And I'm not going to spend time recounting the various factors that led Detroit to the brink, but suffice it to say, it was sort of the same grab bag of factors that you probably talked about in the negative day yesterday, including suburbanization, deindustrialization, high crime, racial strife, underperforming schools. Detroit really had it all. And as those factors took hold, Detroit's population began to decline. In 1950, Detroit was one of the most populous and prosperous cities in the country, with a population base of about 2 million. In 2012, it was less than 700, and it's still declining. At the same time, of course, during this period, its revenues have dropped significantly. Detroit's general fund gets its revenues from 3 sources: the state revenue sharing, city taxes, and fees for city services. And in today's dollars, revenues fell 40% between 1960 and 2012. In today's dollars, notwithstanding the addition of 3 new taxes during that period of time, Detroit still doesn't take in as much tax revenue in total as it did in just property taxes in 1960. So over this period, with fewer residents, a smaller revenue base, and the same 139 square mile geographic footprint, the overall economic conditions and quality of life for Detroit residents degraded dramatically. I just want to share a few of the statistics that help illustrate the magnitude of the problem that we faced when we came into the bankruptcy case, starting with unemployment. The labor market in Detroit had suffered significantly over the years, with the number of Detroit residents employed having dropped more than 53% since 1970. The unemployment rate in 2009 reached 25%, with the underemployment data suggesting it as closer to 50%. The unemployment rate was still at 18% in 2012. The city's violent crime rate was the highest in the nation, with 15,000 violent crimes committed in 2012, more than 5 times the national average. The average national response time by the police department for Priority 1 calls across the country was about 11 minutes. In Detroit, it was 57 minutes. The case clearance rate in Detroit by the police department was under 9%. For similar cities, such as St. Louis and Pittsburgh, the case clearance rate was 3 times higher. Manpower in the police department had been reduced by over 40% in the previous decade. The infrastructure, it sounds like you talked a lot about that yesterday. Our infrastructure was certainly crumbling and unattended. The Detroit Water and Sewer Department, one of the largest such operations in the country, had been under a federal monitor for over 30 years. Repairs and capital improvements had been deferred for decades, and many of the cast iron pipes that support the sewer system dated back to the early 1900s. During the bankruptcy case, we had 1 month where we had 100 water main breaks within the city limits, which was even a record for Detroit. Roughly 85,000 parcels were blighted, about 75,000 of those being residential structures which had to be removed, and about 6,000 vacant lots that needed to be cleared. Our bus system was highly unreliable, with roughly a third of the buses needed to maintain schedule, never even leaving the station on any particular day. And against this backdrop of inadequate city services and crumbling infrastructure, the residents faced the highest tax burden in the country for any major city and paid auto and homeowner rates twice that of its neighboring suburbs. Detroit's high taxes create a particular challenge in Detroit given the low per capita income of about $15,000 per year. The city has the highest resident income taxes and property taxes in the state and is the only city in Michigan with a utility users tax. Detroit residents pay approximately 84 mills of property tax, about 64 of which is city-specific, which is more than twice other communities in the state. Approximately 50% of residents don't even pay property taxes because they can't afford to, and the city systems are so antiquated it can't even track and collect against those who can pay. A few years ago, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, that I think might be represented in this room, published a report on the effective property tax rates among the 50 largest cities in the country and ranked Detroit as first in effective tax rate and last in property value. Financially, the city was in complete disarray as well. The city's accumulated deficit had continued to grow, and but for debt issuances in 2008, 2010, and 2012, the accumulated general fund deficit would have reached $700 million in fiscal year 2013. Pension plan contributions had been deferred, with the city entering into a series of highly risky and complex financing arrangements in 2005 with variable interest rates to hedge against and hedge instruments to hedge against those variable rates. Covenants related to these transactions were ultimately tripped and were ultimately the triggering event that sent Detroit into insolvency. And politically, the city was clawing its way back to some degree of stability following a wave of public corruption never before seen in the city. After convictions in 2010 of both our mayor and our council president, Dave Bing was elected as mayor and restored a baseline of integrity to city government. But most importantly, however, after 8 years of a Democratic governor, who was very popular, but who basically took a hands-off approach to helping Detroit, Michigan elected Governor Rick Snyder, who took office on January 1st, 2011, a Republican, a first-time politician who came into office with a single-minded determination to fix Detroit and force the city to face its fiscal woes. Snyder took a tough love approach from the time he entered office, starting with the quick passage, then in control of both the Senate and the House, the quick passage of Public Act 72, which was a new, essentially emergency manager law that gave the state enhanced powers to identify and intervene in municipalities that were fiscally distressed. After navigating several bumps in the road, including a voter referendum that overturned Public Act 72, Governor Snyder quickly recovered from that and put in place yet another voter-proof EM law and installed Kevin Orr in office in March 2013 as Detroit's emergency manager. Turning to the bankruptcy, I wanted to spend a few minutes on those items that were truly milestones in the case. The case took about 20 months, which anybody who has studied municipal bankruptcies know that's record speed. And there were lots of, obviously, ups and downs and ins and outs over that 20 months. But if I had to distill it to a handful of but-fors, but for these events, we would perhaps still be in bankruptcy, or it certainly wouldn't have been the successful outcome that it was. These are the ones that come to mind. Starting with the mediation, resolution through mediation. Public Act 436, which was the successor EM law that allowed Kevin to go into office as the EM, had baked within it a time frame of 18 months, after which the governing body, in this case Detroit City Council, could remove the EM from office. So Judge Rhodes, the bankruptcy judge, knew from the time he took the case that we had this ticking time bomb, that after 8 months, Kevin would be pulled from office, and then the city would be left to its own devices to oversee and manage this very complex case. So from the outset, Judge Rhodes was determined to set the case on a pace that would allow Kevin to oversee it in its entirety. So that leads to the first event. How he accomplished that was he appointed Chief Judge Jerry Rosen to oversee the case and to assemble a group of mediators. And he got together a group of federal judges and expert mediators who sort of single-handedly, double-teaming, cajoling, berating, threatening, got all of the constituents to the table, and we ended up with a fairly quick negotiated resolution with all those stakeholders. The second key event was the election of Mike Duggan in November of 2013 as mayor. Given that Detroit for decades had been defined by incredibly racially divisive politics, and given that those flames had been recently reignited with the EM law that had been put in place over the voter will, it was truly historic that in a city with 83% African American population, that its first mayor would be elected by a write-in vote, no less, at this particular time. Mayor Duggan was the first white mayor elected in the city in nearly a half a century, which was, again, under the circumstances, amazing. And why did that happen? Well, it was really pretty simple. I think it was the residents recognizing, really enlightened self-interest, that what they needed, and first and foremost, what they wanted, was to get out from under the oversight of the state and a federal bankruptcy court. And the only way to do that was to put in place a credible, capable leader determined to take back the reins. Mike Duggan ran on a strong anti-EM platform with all the rhetoric that went with that, and thankfully it worked, and the citizens elected him. But there are two real reasons why it was critical that Mike came into it. The first was for that very reason that the voters put him in, that I'm not sure that Judge Rosen or Judge Rosen's expert, Judge Rhodes's expert, or the governor for that matter, who ultimately had a say, would have found the plan of adjustment feasible and would have allowed Detroit to exit bankruptcy without that capable leader to hand it over to. Secondly, was what Mike Duggan represented was a credible partner on the operations side. As Catherine indicated, the EM's office steps into the shoes of the governing body, both the mayor and city council. So we were both running the city, the day-to-day operations, not doing a great job of it, and running the bankruptcy case, including key restructuring initiatives. Having Mike come in to be our partner on the operational side was critical. The third piece, also a milestone that but for this case would not have ended up the way it did, was Judge Rhodes's ruling in early December that notwithstanding the state's constitutional guarantee that pensions were protected, his ruling that in fact federal bankruptcy law trumped the state constitution on this point, and that pensions could be compromised. Needless to say, and we did not want that issue heard at the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals or, God forbid, the Supreme Court, because we weren't sure the way it would come down. But having that leverage was absolutely critical to bring the pensioners as a class of creditors and the unions to the table. Just digressing for a moment about the pension plans, because as in many cities, our pension plans were really woefully mismanaged. We had a uniform and non-uniform pension plan. The uniform pension plan was in better shape, but the non-uniform was a wreck. Both plans had high rate of return assumptions of 7.9 and 8%, and the GRS non-uniform had many of its investments way too high a percentage in high-risk real estate deals, and as it turns out, in many cases, corrupt real estate deals. In 2013, for the two plans, the pension boards reported a combined unfunded actuarial accrued liability of $1.5 billion. Revised estimates with more realistic assumptions pegged it at $3.5 billion. Two outrageous and just mind-blowing practices of the GRS pension plan that really led to its serious underfunding were: one was the annuity savings plan, where members could contribute between 3 and 7% of after-tax income and be guaranteed a return of 7.9%, notwithstanding how the actual assets performed. And this was essentially its own little defined pension plan. The second practice was what we called the 13th check practice, when returns for any given year exceeded the assumed return for the plan. Getting ahead of myself, I'm hitting things here. Where all pensioners received a 13th check if the plan performed better than the assumed, rather than it going in, of course, to the plan on years when the plan didn't perform as well as assumed. If the city had not engaged in those two practices, the ASP and the 13th check, and instead had assumed, had reinvested those with a reasonable 6.5% rate of return, from 1985 to 2012, it would have added another $2.5 billion to the pension assets in the GRS pension plan. The fourth event of the case, and truly the capstone, was what we call the grand bargain. This received a lot of national press. You may have heard of it, but two of the most intractable and contentious issues from the outset were the pensions and the art. The DIA is one of the greatest art museums in the country. Its collection is valued in the hundreds of millions or billions, depending on the appraiser. But the bondholders wanted the art sold, understandably, for the benefit of the creditors, and the pensioners wanted their pensions protected against all costs. And then just before Christmas, Judge Rosen, our chief mediator, hatched a truly crazy idea that envisioned a creative solution involving a consortium among the state, private foundations, and the DIA itself to create a substantial enough pool of money that we could save the pensions and save the art. And it was successful. And through intense lobbying and very delicate negotiations, because each of those stakeholders had their demands and had their wants, but what Judge Rosen was able to negotiate was a match by private foundations of $350 million against the state's commitment over 10 years of $350 million, and the DIA with $100 million, for a pot of over $800 million, which went to top up the pensions, and as a result saved the art from monetization. Looking back, it's truly, I mean, that was truly the most incredible moment in the case, and represents, perhaps one of the greatest public-private initiatives for the public good that this country's ever seen. Fifth was approval of the plan by the pensioners, believe it or not, notwithstanding the grand bargain, over $800 million to help mitigate the loss. There was some real concern that some of the pensioners, a vocal minority, wanted to take this up to the Sixth Circuit and see if they could get back everything. But at the end of the day, the pensioners realized that to have in hand a cut that was a fraction of what they would normally otherwise get if that pension ruling were upheld was something that they should vote for, and in fact they did. The result. At the end of the case, the general fund obligations were reduced by about $7 billion, from $10.5 billion to $3.3 billion. OPEB was essentially eliminated at the city, a small VEBA, and pension obligations are less than half of what they were. Scaling these liabilities and obligations will eliminate what would have created about a $4 billion deficit over the next 10 years, and puts us on a track where we can maintain a balanced budget and, as importantly, includes $1.5 billion for reinvestment in the city over the next 10 years for such critical reinvestments as blight removal, technical systems improvements, needed capital investments, and upgrade and training for workers. As a result of the bankruptcy, we have an incredible amount of interest, attention, and new investment in the city, particularly in our 7.2 square mile greater downtown, where occupancy rates for apartments are now 98%, and the commercial vacancy rates for Class A and Class B buildings have reduced by half over the last 4 years. So in conclusion, we accomplished a great deal in a very short period of time. It's truly one of the great municipal comeback stories, I think. We have a sustainable balance sheet. We achieved certain really important outsourcing, like now have actual first world garbage removal with curbside recycling pickup, bulk pickup, something before the city has never had. And we were able to get the city out of the business of operating streetlights and its own electric grid. And finally have a framework for a multi-jurisdiction regional water authority. And Mayor Duggan is continuing to add to these early wins with additional improvements to city services. He's reducing crime, supercharging the relighting of the city through the Public Lighting Authority, and tackling the blight. But a lot of challenges remain. We still own a challenged and very expensive bus system, one of the only major cities that still owns and operates its own buses. San Francisco does too. And we still perform our own vehicle maintenance on our city vehicles. We still operate the city's parking meters and our parking structures. We went into the bankruptcy case with 44 separate collective bargaining units. We still have 44 collective bargaining units. And we still have to run every contract greater than $25,000 past City Council. So we need to continue to chip away at the structural and operational disadvantages in order to stabilize the population base and stem the exodus from the city. And confirm in the meantime that we're staying on course with our budget and our plan of adjustment. As further insurance on that score, and in fact mandated as part of the grand bargain, a Financial Oversight Commission was put in place upon the city's exit from bankruptcy, largely appointed by the state. It's modeled after New York's and DC's financial control boards, and we have certain oversight responsibilities for the city's fiscal matters for many years in the future. I was honored following my role as Deputy Emergency Manager to be appointed by the governor to that Oversight Commission. And we just approved the city's first four-year plan. So we're definitely in our trust but verify phase. But I've been invested emotionally and financially in the city for a long time, and for the first time, I'm really cautiously optimistic. We have a motto that if it were easy, it's not Detroit. And this past year hasn't been easy. Past 2 years haven't been easy, but we're on the road to recovery. So with that, we'll go to questions, and I think Catherine's going to help with that.
Okay, I have questions to start with, but because we have about, I think about 8 minutes, I thought I would just first see if there's a question in the room before turning to my own. No? Great. So Stacy, I wanted to start by talking about the human factor. So inevitably, with this dramatic transformation needed in Detroit, there is a massive incumbent workforce that had been in place and had a certain way of doing things. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that human factor and some of the ways that in managing and bringing about dramatic transformation to municipal operations, you were able to confront that aspect of operations.
Sure. Well, that piece is something in terms of the worker base in the city that hasn't been entirely fixed yet. What we did in our last emergency manager order is we gave broad powers to 3 departments: the IT department, the CFO, Office of the Chief Financial Officer, who came, by the way, from Detroit's or DC's control board, John Hill, really excellent, and human resources to broadly restructure, notwithstanding the civil service rules. And that was Kevin's final EM order, and EM orders under the statute stay in place for 1 year. So there's a lot of work being done now in those 3 critical factors, but worker training and worker upgrade is definitely a challenge. And for a city that's been hobbled by lack of systems and training for years, there is a huge, huge and very steep curve for workers that remain in the city. So it's a combination of upgrading, giving them new tools, training, and frankly, making some changes under Kevin's last EM order to fix some of the critical departments outside of the usual sort of city hiring rules.
Great. I want to look to the floor again. Are there questions out there? Yeah, in the back. Oh, Vlad, just the mic.
Sure. Hi. Vlad Kogan from Ohio State. You've, I think, documented...
From Ohio State?
Ohio State University.
You had to put that in. Okay, I went to Michigan. It's okay.
You documented kind of the dire position of these basic city services like police response times. So I was curious to hear your thoughts about the investment that the state made in the new hockey arena versus using some of those resources to reinvest in those really basic services.
Right. Well, good question. A lot of residents sort of take that view. But at the end of the day, as I said, with the grand bargain, the state absolutely came to the table. And, you know, as somebody who also does real estate development in the city of Detroit, economic development, as you know, through new development and bringing people in, whether it's for entertainment or to live or to play or to work, is really critical in terms of, it has been a critical factor in the downtown's resurgence over the last several years. So you know, I understand. I think, you know, unfortunately, public support is still needed for some of these really important economic development projects that go on in our urban areas. So it's a balance.
More questions from the audience? No. Stacy, could you talk a bit, because this morning we're going to be discussing revenue sources. Could you talk a little bit about, I know when you and I talked about, we discussed some lessons around the city income tax. Could you talk a little bit about some of the things you learned along the way with regard to revenue and either increasing collections rates or building up the business tax base and some of the things that are going to be critical to the success of the city in the future in terms of identifying and sustaining those revenue sources?
Well, collection in the city, as I said, has been a real problem. And so part of our reinvestment dollars are absolutely going to go towards systems that allow us to collect what's owed to the city. But it made national news when the water department, for the first time, got serious about collecting on water bills. And there was a huge outcry from residents about having to pay their water bills because they hadn't, because the city never collected them. So it's really oddly going to be sort of, you know, an education process for residents that, okay, we've got to start collecting on these. And when many of them are still don't have the resources to pay. So our high tax base, and again, it's critical to our plan of adjustment that we maintain that high tax base, but as I said, our taxes are twice as high as the neighboring suburbs. So how can we expect to stem the tide to the suburbs if people are expected to pay twice as much for taxes living in the city? It's a problem. You know, I don't have the answer. That's what the rest of your day is about. But as I said, I mean, ultimately for us, what was the keystone was nearly $1 billion that came from, you know, manna from heaven between the state and private foundations and the art museum to help fix our legacy obligations. And that just can't be replicated. So sometimes it's better to be lucky than good.
I saw the hand in the back first, all the way in the back. Oh, Mayor Driscoll.
Thank you. I had the opportunity to work in the city of Chelsea when they came out of receivership, and I was always struck by the fact that we also had changed the form of government. So it had a mayoral council form that was changed to a city manager form, and it felt like the first year I was there as their legal counsel, we were doing a lot of educating of constituents. How does this work now? Because there were so many institutionalized bad practices there as well that had to be overcome. I'm curious if Detroit has found ways to communicate with residents, because it's really building back that trust and that engagement. I recall raising water rates in Chelsea, like a huge amount to meet some water costs, and nobody showed up at the public hearing. Yeah. Nobody. We could have raised it 40% and nobody was still going to show up. And I thought, wow, we've got to fix this. And I'm curious if Detroit is focused on that community engagement piece. As much as the numbers obviously are so critical,
right.
The sustainability seems like you've got to have the folks who are now paying water bills aware and built in and part of the process.
Yes, Mike Duggan, our new mayor, is absolutely fantastic at generating community engagement and reaching the people. And when he shows up, and he's doing it constantly, he has filled town halls. So he has done a remarkable job of bringing the residents up the learning curve on some of these changing practices and why it's important and necessary, as painful as it might be to them in the short term. So Mayor Duggan has really done a phenomenal job. And as I said, you know, we could not have gotten out of this case without his partnership. Little fact, by the way, is Kevin Orr, Mike Duggan, and I all graduated from Michigan Law School in 1983. So, you know, one day as we're sitting around, it's like, wow, we're responsible for the city? I mean, you know, we've been 35 years ago. We never would have guessed that. But so it was like old home week when the three of us were together for the first time.
A professor somewhere was beaming, no doubt.
That's right, no doubt. Although Kevin and I were always at law school, and we teased Mike that we don't remember ever seeing him in law school. He claims it was because he was busy working, but I don't know how dedicated a student he was.
I think we'll just have one more question.
From your perspective, what type of private investments are most likely to help the city of Detroit recover faster?
That's a good question, and that is a thorny question. So the private investment, as I said, is coming big time in our greater downtown. We have money from New York, money from Mexico. Every time you pick up the paper, some out-of-town huge investor is now investing in development in downtown Detroit. The problem is how that translates to the neighborhoods. And that is something that Mayor Duggan is really focused on, is how you take that level of investment and that economic opportunity that now we can barely keep up with in the greater downtown and transport that out to the neighborhoods. And so they're devising their neighborhood strategy around key corridors. And can you start to bring in some of the retail and build in the key corridors to help support the neighborhoods? But that is going to be one of the most intractable and thorniest problems, I think.
And with that, I just want to thank Stacy again for the time this morning. This was fascinating.
Thank you.